Frank poured himself a steaming cup of black coffee as the frost clung to the windowpane. Outside, the old trailer behind his house sat still like a forgotten shrine. The gentle hum of the AM radio filled the kitchen with the soft croon of a country ballad from a bygone decade. Frank shifted the kettle back onto the stove and eased into the worn chair beside the table, his knees giving a familiar complaint. The newspaper lay half-folded, headline unread. Instead, his gaze drifted to the photo propped up near the salt shaker, his mother, smiling under that same pine tree now visible through the back window. That trailer had seen better days, but it had also seen the best days of his life. Betty used to sit out there every afternoon, wrapped in a tartan blanket, watching cardinals land on the feeder Frank had nailed to the stump. She called it her chapel. Some days she dozed with the wind brushing the tin siding. Others, she listened to Frank read aloud from her favorite mystery novels. After she passed, he left everything just as she had. Even the folded blanket remained on the bench inside. He took a slow sip of his coffee and adjusted his glasses. A few brown leaves tapped against the pane as the wind picked up. Across the yard, the trailer rested in its usual place, backed up against the woods, half swallowed by fallen pine needles. To Frank, it was more than just a hunk of rusted metal, it was a relic. A witness. A monument. Outside, the sound of footfalls on gravel drew closer, then a pause. Frank turned his head as the knock came, soft but firm. He opened the door to find a tall woman in a burgundy blazer, clipboard in hand, smile professionally fixed. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," she said with practiced cheer. "Morning," Frank replied, holding the door half open. "I'm Jerry Withers, president of the Pine Brook HOA. I'm sure we've met at least once, probably during the annual bake sale last spring." Frank nodded politely, though he hadn't attended. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. Just a quick note, your trailer out back has come up in our compliance checks. It's not quite in line with the visual harmony standards of our community." Frank tilted his head. "You mean it's an eyesore?" Jerry gave a tight chuckle. "Well, that's not how we'd phrase it, but yes. We're just trying to keep Pine Brook looking its best. I'm sure you understand. It's been there for 35 years, he said, his voice steady. Yes, and we've just updated our guidelines, Jerry replied, tapping her clipboard. According to Section 8C, all auxiliary structures must be removed if not in use and visible from the street. You have 14 days to comply. Frank didn't move, didn't frown. He merely nodded once. I'll think about it. Her smile cooled by a few degrees. It's not optional, I'm afraid. We expect full compliance. The HOA rules are clear. I'm sure they are, he murmured. She turned to leave, her heels crunching on the frostbitten gravel. Quincy passed by with his beagle, giving Frank a two-finger salute. Morning, Frank. Morning, Quincy. The cold followed Frank as he shut the door. He set his coffee down and walked to the corner of the living room where an old cedar cabinet stood. He opened the creaky door, reached behind a stack of almanacs, and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were property records, signed deeds, and his mother's will. He flipped through them with slow, practiced fingers until he found the document he wanted. You don't get to erase memories that easily, he whispered to no one in particular. The house settled with a groan. Outside, the wind carried a final trace of perfume and clipped vowels. We expect compliance, Mr. Edwards. The bell above Lily's Spoon Diner jingled as Frank pushed the door open, boots clicking softly on the tiled floor. The warmth of the place met him instantly, heat from the griddle mingling with the scent of maple syrup and bacon. Yellowed walls bore framed photos of the town from half a century ago, harvest parades, old storefronts, and one shot of the original train station that no longer stood. The booth by the window sat empty, just like it always had at 7:10 a.m. Helen appeared from behind the counter, pencil in hair, apron slightly dusted with flour. Your usual, hon, she said without waiting for an answer, already reaching for the brown mug that bore Frank's name in chipped cursive. He offered a small smile and took his seat by the window. Outside, the trees rattled in the breeze, their branches skeletal now. The first frost always made the town quieter somehow. The same table by the window, the same mug, but something about this morning felt off. Quincy slid into the booth across from him, unzipping his fleece jacket halfway. "They got you too, huh?" he asked, voice low. Frank glanced over his glasses. "You heard already? Half the town has. Someone posted the HOA letter on the bulletin board at the post office. Real classy move." Helen returned with a plate, scrambled eggs, toast, and sausage links. She topped off Frank's coffee without a word, then turned to Quincy. "You want your usual or feelin' adventurous?" "Just a coffee, sweetheart." Frank stirred a packet of sugar slowly. "Funny thing," he said, "they waited until after Mom passed." Quincy looked down at the table. "Yeah. A lot of us figured they were biting their tongues out of respect. Jerry's always had her eye on that back lot." Mrs. Callahan shuffled in with her cane and headed straight for her usual corner, nodding to Frank. She moved slow these days but still dressed like Sunday even on a Thursday. "Morning, gentlemen," she said. "They say they're coming for your trailer." Frank nodded once. "So they've said." She clicked her tongue. "I remember when we didn't even have an HOA. People helped one another, didn't hound each other." Quincy leaned forward. "Lou's got a theory. Says they're planning a beautification initiative, fancy talk for turning the lot into a community garden." Frank sipped his coffee. "Wouldn't that be something? Plant flowers where memories used to sit." A moment passed. Lou entered, silent as ever, and took his place near the counter. He gave Frank a subtle nod. For a former cop, he had a way of noticing things without appearing to. After a beat, he called out, "They've gone too far this time." Frank raised his mug slightly in acknowledgement. "Next they'll tell me my porch chairs are a violation," Mrs. Callahan muttered. Helen returned with Quincy's coffee and topped off Frank's mug again without asking. "Free refill, sweetie," she said, patting the counter. "But the gossip? That'll cost ya." Quincy chuckled. "Guess that's fair." From the next booth, a voice chimed in, Marla, who ran the town's hardware store. "They've marked your lot for Phase 2. Got the plans in the town office, if you know where to look." Frank lowered his fork. "Plans?" Marla nodded. "Part of the neighborhood elevation project. Means anything they find inconsistent could be removed or fined." The clatter of dishes, the muted murmur of conversation, all seemed to fade for a moment. Frank stood slowly and pulled on his coat. "Y'all have a good morning," he said. "You too, Frank," came a chorus in reply. He stepped outside, the cold sharper now, and found a cream envelope tucked into his mailbox. HOA letterhead. Unfolded, the language was clearer this time. Non-compliance would incur a fine of $200 per day beginning in 3 days. He didn't frown. Didn't curse. Just stared at the page for a long beat, then slipped it into his coat pocket. At the curb, he paused. The diner's bell jingled behind him again as someone left. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a small photograph, the edges worn from years of touch. It showed his mother seated inside the trailer, book in hand, sunlight streaking through the window behind her. He looked at it. Then at the street. Then tucked it carefully into his coat and turned, eyes set with a quiet determination. The rumble of a diesel engine broke the morning silence. Frank stepped onto his porch just in time to see the tow truck back toward the trailer. The early November fog clung to the ground, wrapping the yard in a damp gray shroud. Leaves had settled thick across the lawn, mostly maple, bright red and orange now dulled by dew. Frank hadn't yet poured his coffee. The kettle still sat on the stove, just beginning to hiss. He stood motionless for a breath, one hand resting on the porch railing, the other gripping the worn bill of his mother's old Arkansas Razorbacks cap. The tow truck rolled in reverse, slow and deliberate, its exhaust a steady stream of white breath against the morning chill. Frank stepped off the porch, boots crunching the gravel, and approached with calm, each stride firm. A tall man in coveralls hopped down from the driver's seat. His face was unreadable, hidden behind a grizzled beard and mirrored sunglasses. He didn't speak, didn't look at Frank, just unlatched the trailer hitch and began unwinding thick chains from the bed. "What's this?" Frank asked, voice quiet but unwavering. The man kept working. A second car pulled up, sleek, dark, and cold. Jerry stepped out in a tailored coat, clipboard in hand, flanked by two stern-looking men in matching navy jackets bearing the HOA seal. She walked with authority, tapping her pen once against the papers clipped before her. "Mr. Edwards," she said smoothly, "you were given proper notice. 14 days. This is standard enforcement." Frank tilted his head. "Did you even ask why it's there?" "It's immaterial," she replied, not meeting his gaze. "The bylaws are clear. No non-permanent structures within 20 feet of the rear property line. Section 4C. The chains rattled against the gravel as the driver locked the final clasp. The trailer groaned as it shifted under its own weight, creaking like an old man rising from bed. Frank took a step forward, hand raised in protest, but one of the HOA men moved subtly to block his path. The driver climbed back into the cab. The engine growled louder. With a jolt, the truck lurched forward, pulling the trailer behind it. The metal groaned in protest, and a screech rang out as the trailer's undercarriage scraped the driveway. Frank stood rooted to the spot, watching as the only place that still held his mother's scent and silence was hauled away like trash. Neighbors had begun to gather, silent figures in the fog. Some with coffee mugs in hand, some with arms crossed. Mrs. Callahan was there, lips pursed. A young man across the street lifted his phone, recording. Jerry didn't look at any of them. When the trailer cleared the edge of the property, the driver swung wide and accelerated down the hill. The chains clinked once, then went still. Only silence remained. Frank stepped off the path and knelt in the gravel. Where the trailer had sat, the earth was bare, cold and flattened. Deep grooves marked the tire's exit path, two wide furrows pressing into damp dirt. Without a word, he extended one hand and began smoothing over the tracks, palm dragging across the sharp grit. Tiny stones bit into his skin. A thin line of blood welled up from his knuckle and trailed down to his wrist. He didn't stop. He kept going until the grooves blurred, until only the smear of motion remained. "You don't get to erase memories that easily," he muttered, not to Jerry, not to anyone, just to the space now left behind. Jerry turned back toward her car, already checking boxes on her clipboard. The two HOA men followed without a word. Frank remained crouched, breath visible in the cold. From the sidewalk, a voice called out, running closer. "Mr. Edwards, you're not alone. We can fight this." Frank straightened his old flannel shirt and checked the town hall's clock. He hadn't stood at a podium in decades. The hands ticked past 6:15. Outside, night had fallen early, and the chill seeped through even the heavy stone of the building. Inside the meeting room, the glow of yellow lights bounced off wooden paneling, casting long shadows across the lines of metal folding chairs. The ceiling fan above turned in lazy circles. Coats rustled, thermoses clicked open, and the murmur of neighbors filled the space like distant rainfall. The place smelled faintly of wood polish and cold air carried in on scarves and sleeves. Jerry sat center stage at a raised table, spine straight, lips pressed into a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. A placard read, "Chairwoman, Pine Brook HOA." To her right sat the HOA secretary, scribbling quietly in a notebook. On the left, the clerk watched the crowd with detached focus, ready to log each voice that approached the podium. "Good evening," Jerry began, tapping her pen against the microphone. "Tonight's agenda, maintaining neighborhood standards. We'll be addressing continued efforts to uphold the aesthetic and regulatory values that make Pine Brook a desirable community." A few polite nods followed, a few eyes rolled. Frank said nothing. He waited, the worn photo of his mother folded into the inside pocket of his coat, and the petition tucked neatly under his arm. "If anyone wishes to speak," the clerk called out, "please write your name on the clipboard circulating row by row." Frank waited until the board reached him. He scribbled his name without flourish and handed it off. When his name was called 20 minutes later, he rose with deliberate calm. Boots echoed on the hardwood floor. A few heads turned, some whispered. Quincy gave a small nod from the third row. Mrs. Callahan clutched a lace handkerchief even before he spoke. Frank cleared his throat. My name is Frank Edwards. I live at 82 Juniper Lane. I'd like to talk about a trailer that used to sit behind my home. His voice cracked faintly on the last word. He paused. A breath. Then, steadier, that trailer belonged to my mother. Not in a legal sense, on paper, sure, it was mine. But in spirit, in memory, it was hers. He took the photo from his coat, held it up briefly. That's her. Reading in the sun. Right there, in that trailer, she watched the seasons change. She read mystery novels and wrote postcards to her sister in Michigan. She listened to the Cardinals on the radio and watched the red leaves drift down like blessings. Silence stretched. Even the fans above seemed to hush. She lived with me for 10 years after the stroke. Refused to be put in a home. That trailer was her haven. When she passed, I left it as it was. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I sat in there some evenings, just listening. It's where I remember her best. From the second row, someone sniffled. I understand regulations, he continued. I'm not asking for chaos. But some things, some places, carry more than clutter. They carry grief. Memory. Love. Jerry leaned forward, eyes narrowed. This is not personal business, Mr. Edwards. Please keep to matters of community relevance. He turned toward her, jaw set. You didn't tow a structure. You towed my mother's grave. A ripple moved through the room like wind through dry grass. Quincy's mouth parted slightly. Mrs. Callahan lowered her head, dabbing her eyes. Helen, arms crossed near the back, stared straight at Jerry with a narrowed gaze. Frank placed the petition on the edge of the podium. I'm requesting a review of the towing policy. Specifically, the right of residents to appeal before enforcement, and an exception clause for family memorial structures. Jerry pursed her lips. That's not. Lou stood up from the back. His voice, gravelly and unhurried, carried clear. I second Frank's proposal for a vote on towing policy. A few others stirred. Phones emerged. Someone whispered, this man just broke our hearts, as a shutter clicked. Frank said no more. He stepped away from the podium and returned to his seat, the room's silence saying more than words ever could. The smell of sweet potato casserole and fried chicken filled the air as folding tables lined the church hall. Frank lingered at the threshold, unsure if his presence would be welcome. The warmth of the room was immediate, light from paper lanterns swayed above, laughter bubbled between rows of tables covered in plaid cloths, and the hum of familiar voices wove through the clatter of plastic utensils and paper plates. He adjusted the sleeves of his sweater, nervously straightened his collar, and walked inside, heart thudding louder than the floorboards under his boots. He found a seat at the far end of the hall, near the exit, partly to slip out unnoticed and partly out of habit. Frank wasn't used to gatherings like these anymore. The last time he'd sat down for a Thanksgiving meal with more than one person was over a decade ago, with his mother, a turkey sandwich, and an old AM radio playing scratchy Bing Crosby tunes. His fingers idly traced the rim of his styrofoam cup as he listened. Stories flew across the tables, some about grandkids visiting from Tulsa, others about recipes passed down from the Depression years. Frank half smiled at the mention of green bean casserole, the way his mom used to layer hers with extra fried onions. Mr. Edwards, came a voice beside him. He turned to see Quincy, balancing a plate overloaded with turkey, mashed potatoes, and what looked suspiciously like vegan chili. Brought this for you. Hope you don't mind spice. Frank raised an eyebrow. Didn't take you for a chili man. I'm not. But traditions gotta evolve, right? Quincy grinned, sliding the plate onto the table before sitting down. You started something, old man. Before Frank could reply, Helen appeared with a plastic cup of cider and a slice of pumpkin pie. "Don't be acting shy back here," she said, hand on her hip. "We want to hear about that trailer. That story about your mama, it stayed with a lot of us." Frank hesitated, the words lodging at the base of his throat. But then he looked around. Lou sat nearby, arms crossed but eyes soft. Mrs. Callahan dabbed her mouth with a napkin, nodding slightly, as if to encourage him. Even a pair of teenagers had turned down their music buds, giving him the rarest of gifts, undivided attention. He exhaled. "My mother loved that trailer," he began. "It was her world after she got too sick to walk the trails. Every morning, she'd sit out there, wrapped in a blanket, drinking instant coffee and watching the squirrels fight over acorns." A quiet settled over the room. She said it gave her dignity. And peace. Said it was the only place she didn't feel like a burden. "When she passed, I couldn't bring myself to take it down. It was more than aluminum and bolts. It was her presence. Her comfort. Her grave, in a way." Someone sniffled. Helen placed a napkin near his hand. "I didn't expect a battle. I just wanted a quiet life. But now I see it wasn't just about me." The room buzzed as heads nodded. From across the table, Lou leaned in. "There's a clause in the original land charter, before the HOA even formed. Might be a way around all this." Frank's eyes narrowed. "A loophole?" Lou nodded. "The property lines. They can't enforce structure removal without a 2/3 vote if the structure predates HOA jurisdiction." Whispers erupted. A woman in a red scarf reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. "That's why we're all signing this," she said, sliding a stack of papers toward him. "Petition to review and revise Article 6 of the HOA policy. No more unilateral enforcement. No more towing people's memories." Frank stared at the stack. Names filled the first page: Callahan, Quincy, Lou, Helen, and a dozen more he recognized from over the years. The signatures curled and dipped like roots stretching through time, binding them all. The front door creaked. Heads turned. Jerry stood at the entrance, arms folded, lips tight. Her eyes swept the room, scanning the joviality, the laughter, the food laid out like offerings at a communal altar. No one invited her in. No one stood to greet her. Frank met her gaze across the room. He didn't move. Neither did she. She took one long look, then turned and left, the door swinging gently behind her. Quincy's truck kicked up gravel as he pulled up with an envelope marked "Urgent, Property Records Office." Frank was already in the garage, seated on an overturned milk crate, elbows resting on his knees. His breath made clouds in the cold air, swirling around the faded rays of sunlight that filtered through the cracks in the warped metal door. The smell of motor oil and cedar dust clung to everything. Beside him, a rusted fireman's helmet hung on the wall, a reminder of a younger man's bravery, or perhaps just a town's memory. The envelope landed in his lap before Quincy even spoke. "Fresh from the county office, Mr. E. Had to charm 2 clerks and promise them homemade fudge, but I got it." Frank cracked a small grin. "Your bribes are getting sweeter." Quincy chuckled and leaned against the workbench, knocking a box of tangled extension cords aside. This could be your golden ticket." Inside the envelope, a photocopy of a deed from 1987 sat atop a stack of records. Frank took his time reading it, the paper shaking slightly in his gloved hands. His lips moved silently as he traced each line, eyes pausing at the lot description. "The trailer's on an easement," he muttered. "Yeah," Quincy confirmed, and more importantly, the easement was designated for family use, predating the HOA charter by at least a decade. That little strip of land? It was carved out separate from the HOA's jurisdiction. Frank looked up slowly, the weight of possibility dawning on him. So they never had the right. Not on that sliver, Quincy nodded. They can govern lawns, fences, maybe holiday lights. But that trailer? It was never in their sandbox. Frank reached for an old leather binder under the workbench. Dust clouded into the air as he opened it. Inside were yellowed documents, an obituary for his mother, and a business card from a local law office, Sims and Dorsey, Real Property Law. He dialed the number, waited through a series of hold tones, and finally heard a voice at the other end. Sims and Dorsey, how may I assist? This is Frank Edwards. I believe you handled some easement paperwork for my mother in the late 80s. Give me just a moment, the clerk said, the sound of typing echoing faintly. Yes. Doris Edwards. Easement recorded June 4, 1987, with a clause for permanent non-commercial use tied to the Edwards estate. You're listed as successor. Frank sat back. And HOA rules wouldn't override that? Not unless your bylaws include retroactive jurisdiction, the clerk replied. And that's extremely rare. You might want to consult a litigator, but from where I'm sitting, they overstepped. Frank hung up slowly. He stared at the old radio cassette player across the garage, the same one that once played his mother's morning jazz. Outside, the fog swirled like smoke over the frosted lawn. His phone rang again. He checked the screen. Jerry. He answered without a word. You're poking a hornet's nest, Frank, she said, voice taut like a taut piano wire. He didn't respond at first. Then, softly, I know how to wear gloves. There was a long silence. Then a click. Frank stood, his joints creaking but movements firm. He tucked the deed and photocopies into a worn leather folder and zipped it into his winter coat. His boots thudded against the floor as he crossed to the wall, placing a hand on the old town map from 1962. His mother had once outlined their property there in pencil, long before neighborhood councils came along. He ran a finger along the edge, whispering to himself. They tried to erase you. But they can't erase paper. Quincy appeared beside him again, holding 2 steaming mugs of instant cocoa. So what's next? Frank didn't answer immediately. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the creased photo of his mother beside the trailer, smiling under a quilt, coffee cup in hand. He slipped it back in carefully. Then, with a glint in his eye that hadn't been there in weeks, he said, it's time for a very public Christmas surprise. That December evening, Pine Hollow sparkled, every porch decked in holiday lights, except one. Frank stood near the small public park, bundled in his mother's old woolen coat, its faded maroon buttons catching a hint of gold from the LED stars overhead. His breath came in slow puffs as he surveyed the scene, strings of soft white light swaying gently from gutters and railings, windows outlined in steady gleam, even the bare oaks strung with glowing orbs like lanterns of quiet defiance. Across the street, one house sat in cold shadow, Jerry's. Her porch was bare, the yard dark, a quiet black hole among the constellation of warm displays. It didn't go unnoticed. Frank moved toward the makeshift sign near the park cedar tree, carefully brushing snow off its edge. In bold lettering, in memory of Betty Edwards, not forgotten. He stepped back just as Quincy arrived, shoulders hunched under the weight of 2 battery packs and a duffel full of cables. Stage is set, he said. Lights'll sync with the audio. You sure you want to run the video? Frank nodded slowly. It's not just about me anymore. Quincy plugged in the last connector. The speaker system hissed, then settled. The large screen, borrowed from Lou's old community center days, flickered to life. Neighbors clustered around, some holding paper cups of cocoa, others wrapped in knitted scarves, mittens touching phones to snap photos. Helen wore a jingle bell hat and handed out candy canes. Lou stood off to the side, arms crossed. You stirred something real here, Frank. As the video began, silence fell. It showed footage of the trailer being towed, Jerry's voice declaring policy, the screech of steel, Frank standing still. Then it cut to a brief clip, the land charter, highlighted lines about easement exclusions. Quincy had timed it all precisely. The last frame read, respect isn't a policy. It's earned. Applause erupted, not thunderous, but steady, long. Helen dabbed at her eyes. Children lit sparklers. Mrs. Callahan whispered to her daughter, I remember when this town had heart. Camera crews from the Pine Brook Gazette had shown up earlier, alerted by a quiet tip. Now they filmed everything: the lights, the crowd, the sign, the silence where one house stood unlit. Then came the hiss of tires on snow-packed pavement. Jerry. She stepped out of her car, wrapped in a dark trench coat, jaw tight. Her gaze swept the crowd, searching for someone, anyone, who might return her familiar nod of approval. No one did. She marched up to the park border and called out, "This is against regulations. You can't use public land for unauthorized gatherings." Frank turned slowly, voice calm. "So was your towing notice." The words hung in the air like frost crystals, sharp and undeniable. Some in the crowd gasped. Others just nodded. Jerry flushed, her mouth tightening. But the people didn't disperse. The lights didn't go out. Quincy adjusted the audio subtly, and soft instrumental carols began playing over the speakers, peaceful, resolute. Frank took a step closer to Quincy, eyes still on the lights strung above the trees. "Tomorrow," he said under his breath, "we drop the real paperwork." Christmas morning was quiet, until a black car with a county seal parked in front of Jerry's house. Frank stood by his front window, hands wrapped around a steaming mug. The hush of morning clung to Pine Hollow like fresh snow, soft and unbroken. But the sleek county vehicle, engine humming low, cut through the stillness like a razor through ribbon. He stepped onto his porch as the inspector, a woman in a gray coat and precise boots, made her way toward Jerry's front steps. Jerry answered the door in a housecoat, hair unpinned, the sharpness in her eyes dulled by something heavier than fatigue, certainty unraveling. From across the street, Frank watched her lips move rapidly, a hand gesturing toward the mailbox, then pointing vaguely toward his house. The inspector remained still, holding up a clipboard. Then came the request. Frank couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. He'd seen enough inspections in his lifetime. Jerry turned, disappeared inside, then re-emerged with a folder. The inspector flipped through the pages, paused, then said something that made Jerry's face pale. Several neighbors had begun gathering in driveways, coats pulled tight, mugs in hand. A phone camera blinked red across the street. Minutes later, Jerry stepped down the porch without a word. She didn't make eye contact. She crossed the yard, passed the now wilting wreath on her door, got into her car, and drove off, no farewell, no protest. The inspector approached Frank with a nod. "You were right, Mr. Edwards. HOA doesn't have jurisdiction on the easement lot. That action was unlawful." She handed him an official letter, stamped and signed. "Merry Christmas." Frank read it once. Then again. His fingers didn't tremble, not anymore. Over the next few days, Pine Hollow transformed in ways no one expected. By New Year's, the trailer was back, not as a symbol of defiance, but of memory reclaimed. With Quincy's help, Frank had restored the inside, shelves lined the walls, filled with books donated by neighbors. A small plaque above the door read, "Betty's Corner, a place for stories." People came and went. Helen brought puzzles, Mrs. Callahan contributed a recipe binder titled Meals That Made Us, Lou donated old town records. Children curled up on beanbags, reading under fairy lights. At the next HOA meeting, a vote passed unanimously, amendment to protect private memorials and structures of historical or emotional value. No one contested. Frank didn't need to speak. His actions had already said enough. Christmas faded into winter's quiet stretch. One evening, a soft chorus drifted through the air. Seniors from the local church gathered by the trailer, their voices weaving silent night into the crisp night sky. Frank stood a few feet back, arms folded, gaze steady. Helen had sent a card earlier that day. Inside, just one line, "You reminded us what it means to be a neighbor." As the song wound to its final note, Frank stepped up to the trailer's porch. A single white candle stood in the window. He lit it, shielding the flame from the wind. The warm glow flickered, casting a soft shadow on the wood-paneled interior. He looked up toward the trees, then to the stars overhead. "Merry Christmas, Ma," he whispered. "We did it." The trailer never truly left Pine Hollow, it simply waited for the right moment to return, carrying not just memories, but meaning. What started as one man's quiet resistance became a chorus of neighbors rediscovering their voice and their values. When rules are used for good, communities thrive. When they're misused, they crumble. Perhaps the real strength of a neighborhood isn't found in tidy lawns or painted fences, but in shared courage, quiet kindness, and the will to stand together. Like a porch light glowing through winter fog, one small act of defiance can brighten the whole block.